The Pentagon just released its annual report on Chinese military power and the threat it poses to the U.S. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institution. Michael, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you write in a recent piece about the report that, quote, we are tending towards overhyping the Chinese threat. What do you mean?
Well, I think China is our most consequential strategic competitor. That's a phrase that's sometimes employed in recent documents like the National Security Strategy. The National Defense Strategy that also came out this fall talks about China as the pacing challenge. I agree with all that. China certainly has the scientific and technological and industrial base and the size of a military budget that makes it the #1 challenge for us. And there are some goals that are incompatible in their foreign policy and ours, especially over Taiwan, South China Sea. However, I don't know that China's trying to upside down turn over the world order the way that Vladimir Putin is right now. They're not using lethal military force as a rule, although there have been a couple of exceptions that are troubling. And to my mind, this is a rising power that is behaving sort of like a rising power. And we're going to have to accept that that's going to pose some challenges to us, but not overreact. One specific example of overreacting, not so much in this report, but in previous documents and statements, we're calling China guilty of genocide in the Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur population has been oppressed. And I think China is committing human rights violations on a large scale there. It's not genocide. It's not killing hundreds of thousands of people. Our minds know what that term means. And yet official documents are starting to use that kind of term. We just got to be careful and a little bit calm in how we talk about the China threat.
So the Pentagon report says that China has the intent and the capacity to reshape the international order. You disagree with that?
Yeah, I do. I don't quite go with that framing. I think China wants to have greater influence on the global order. And I think, for example, they would prefer not to have our Navy ships so close to their shores, and they don't quite agree with our interpretation of the law of the sea. I'm not saying they're right, but I am saying that's a specific thing they want to change. They want to have more influence at the UN. Do they always do it in a, collegial way? No, they're pushy. And, that's troubling. But they're still working within the UN system. Do they want to have a little greater influence in shaping the border with India? And that led to a tragic loss of life a couple of years ago. Yes, they're trying to push for that change, but are they trying to absorb entire countries the way Vladimir Putin is or has with Ukraine? No. So the problems are specific, they're serious, but they are not of a nature that suggests China wants to completely overturn the global order.
China has the largest navy in the world at this point by ship count. Do you see that as an important metric?
Yes, but it's the only one we tend to use when it's only one. And in some calculations that former Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg and I did in our book 8 years ago, we pointed out that at that time, U.S. Navy aggregate tonnage for all of our ships was 3 times what China had. Even today, it's still twice what China has. In other words, we build bigger ships. And by the way, they're also better. So we have size, we have qualitative advantages. Yes, China has more actual vessels, and China's catching up. And by the way, none of these metrics is conclusive by itself. And there are a lot of areas of Chinese improved capability that I am worried about. Their anti-ship ballistic missiles, their precise, accurate cruise missiles, and now some of their quieter submarines. So we have to keep our eye on the Chinese Navy. But why do we always use the one metric designed to make them look stronger than we are? I think we could almost talk ourselves into a feeling of inferiority if we're not careful. But we could also convey this sense of an out-of-control Chinese arms race behavior, which is really not consistent with the facts.
Well, speaking of arms race, let's talk about nuclear weapons. Yep. What do we know about their intention to expand their nuclear forces?
Okay, first of all, let's remember we have 5,000. We think they have 400. Historically, they've been in the 200 to 300 range of total nuclear warheads.
Well, you only need one to take out a city.
And you only need one. So, the fact that there are now 9 nuclear powers on Earth, that's a lot less than John Kennedy predicted 60 years ago, but it's still enough to be concerning. And certainly the North Korean nuclear arsenal worries me. But China has 400. They seem to be ramping up. They're building more silos where they could put long-range ICBMs. And other behaviors suggest they're expanding that force to perhaps 1,000 warheads, maybe up to 1,500 by 2035. That's what the Pentagon report says. I'm grateful for that information. There's a lot of good information in the report. I'm not trying to, somehow throw a criticism over the whole thing. However, even if they went up to 1,500, it would take them more than a decade, we think, and they'd still only have 30% of our total. So That's concerning. That's worse for us than the previous situation, but it doesn't suggest that they want to overturn the world order.
But the American nuclear triad is aging and in desperate need of modernization. So is that an issue here?
Well, it's an issue in the sense we got to keep at it. We are keeping after it. We are modernizing and, most importantly, making safe that nuclear arsenal. For example, we're replacing our submarine fleet, and it's going to take a while. We got to stay on schedule, not because we need better nuclear weapons, but we need a safe, survivable ballistic missile submarine force. And the current force is starting to show the wear and tear of being underwater for so many years, where there's pressure on the hull. So there are other kinds of things like that. As you know, just recently, the B-21 bomber was unveiled. We have to keep modernizing the air-breathing part of the nuclear triad. And the good news about that is you can use it in conventional conflict. It's not just for a war that you hope and expect never to fight. So, yes, I want to keep after most of the nuclear modernization agenda, $1.3 trillion worth, but it's important, and I support that.
Michael, obviously the United States can project power globally. Is China at that point? Can they project power? Can they have influence globally, or is it just in the Pacific?
Well, they can have influence with their economy globally, and they're doing a pretty impressive job of that, and sometimes that's a challenge to us. Sometimes it's a fair competition. Depends on the situation. With their Navy, they're starting to try to develop some presence up towards the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Djibouti, et cetera, and they have occasional forays elsewhere. But in terms of global positioning and posture, we are still far and away the superpower. But they are trying to change that. Again, I don't like that as an American strategist, but I'm not that surprised by it. We sort of showed the way of how a superpower behaves in the 21st century. And if China wants to catch up a little, we don't necessarily have to view that as a hostile act. It's concerning, it's competitive, it may not be aggressive or hostile.
Really quickly, Michael, is the issue that you have with the Pentagon's report more semantics, how they're naming things, or is it with respect to policy?
That's a good question. You know, I don't really object to most of what we're doing with our Navy in the Western Pacific. I do support the freedom of navigation exercises we do, or the patrols that China tries to resist. I think we're right to want to, insist on that access. I'd like to see us help Taiwan protect itself, and if necessary, perhaps come to Taiwan's aid in a crisis with our military. So I don't really object on those grounds. But there are some semantic issues that could lead us in a dangerous direction. We could, for example, overhype a crisis and overreact if we've convinced ourselves that China's trying to overturn the world order. So the semantics matter.
All right, Michael, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.